Most vegetables die at the end of every season. You plant, harvest, pull out the remains, and start over the following year. Tomatoes, beans, squash, they all follow this cycle. Every spring, you begin again from scratch. But a small group of vegetables operate differently. They establish permanent systems underground that survive winter and regenerate growth year after year. Some produce for a decade, others for 2 decades or more. These vegetables grow like fruit trees. When we say a vegetable grows like a fruit tree, we mean something specific. Fruit trees establish permanent root systems and woody structures that persist through dormancy. You plant them once. They take time to mature. Then they produce harvests for years or decades without replanting. The vegetables in this guide share that pattern. They form persistent roots, crowns or woody stems that store energy, survive winter, and push new growth each season. Once established, they require no annual seed starting, no transplanting, and no bed preparation. This is not about reducing effort. It is about shifting from annual cycles to long-term biological systems. Not every perennial plant qualifies. To appear in this guide, a vegetable must meet 3 criteria. First, it must form a permanent structure that reliably survives winter and regenerates without intervention. Second, it must produce an edible vegetable crop, not just herbs or flavoring. Third, it must be reasonably accessible to home gardeners in temperate or warm temperate climates. Plants that require annual division, constant management, or greenhouse protection are excluded. Short-lived biennials are excluded unless they self-renew so reliably that they function as perennials. What remains is a practical list of vegetables that establish permanent food-producing systems in home gardens. One expectation to set clearly: these plants require patience. Most need 1 to 3 years to establish before they reach full productivity. The trade-off is that this establishment period is a one-time investment. The years of harvest that follow require minimal ongoing work. We begin underground. The first category includes vegetables that store energy in roots or tubers. These plants survive winter entirely below the soil surface. The above-ground growth dies back, but the underground storage organs persist and fuel regrowth each spring. This category includes some of the most persistent and lowest maintenance perennial vegetables available. Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke, is a North American native that produces clusters of edible tubers with a crisp texture and mild, nutty flavor. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The tubers function as permanent underground storage. Any tuber left in the soil after harvest survives winter and produces new plants the following spring. The patch does not diminish over time. It expands. A single planting becomes a self-sustaining colony that produces indefinitely. Why it requires little care. Jerusalem artichoke tolerates poor soil, drought, and partial shade. It rarely needs fertilization and resists most pests and diseases. Once established, it tends to outcompete weeds without assistance, the common mistake that causes failure. Planting in a prime garden bed without containment. This plant spreads aggressively through small tuber fragments left during harvest. Without barriers, it will colonize surrounding areas within a few seasons. Plant it in a dedicated space with root barriers, or accept that it will expand beyond its original boundaries. Climate note: hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9. Horseradish produces thick white taproots with an intensely pungent flavor, used as a condiment. The plant forms clumps of large, coarse leaves and establishes deep, Persistent root systems. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The root system is remarkably resilient. The central taproot and lateral roots survive winter and regenerate foliage each spring. Even small root fragments left in the soil after harvest will grow into new plants. Once established, horseradish is essentially permanent. Why it requires little care. Horseradish tolerates a wide range of soil conditions, including heavy clay. It needs little to no supplemental watering once established, rarely requires fertilization, and has few significant pest or disease problems in most regions. The common mistake that causes failure. Planting in a location where it may eventually be unwanted. Horseradish is extremely difficult to remove once established. Even thorough digging leaves root fragments that regenerate. This is a permanent planting decision. Climate note. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9. Now we move above the soil line, but only slightly. The next category includes vegetables that grow from a central crown structure. The crown is a dense mass of root and stem tissue, at or just below the soil surface. It stores energy during the growing season and uses that energy to produce new growth the following year. Crown plants are among the longest-lived perennial vegetables. Some produce for 15 years or more from a single planting, rivaling the productive lifespan of many fruit trees. Asparagus produces tender edible spears each spring from an underground crown. A well-maintained asparagus bed can remain productive for 2 decades or more. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The crown stores energy during summer when the fern-like foliage photosynthesizes. This stored energy fuels spear production the following spring. The crown expands slightly each year, gradually increasing yield over time. Like a fruit tree, asparagus tends to improve with age rather than declining. Why it requires little care. After establishment, asparagus requires only annual weeding and an optional top dressing of compost. It has few serious pest or disease problems in most regions, and typically does not need supplemental irrigation in areas with normal rainfall. The common mistake that causes failure. Harvesting too early. New asparagus crowns need 2 to 3 years to establish energy reserves before any harvest. Cutting spears during this period weakens the crown and can prevent the plant from ever reaching full productivity. The first years require patience. Climate note. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8. Requires winter dormancy and does not perform well in tropical or subtropical climates. Rhubarb produces thick, tart stalks used in pies, sauces, and preserves. The plant forms dramatic clumps of large leaves and can remain productive for a decade or more. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The crown stores energy in a thick root structure that survives winter dormancy. Each spring, the crown pushes up new stalks without any intervention. Established plants often increase in size and productivity for several years before stabilizing. Why it requires little care. Rhubarb tolerates cold, poor soil, and partial shade. It seldom needs regular fertilization and has few pest problems. An annual application of compost is beneficial, but not strictly necessary. The common mistake that causes failure. Harvesting stalks in the first year after planting. Like asparagus, rhubarb needs time to build root reserves. Harvesting during establishment weakens the crown and reduces long-term productivity. Allow the plant to grow undisturbed for 1 full year before beginning light harvests. Climate note. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8. Requires cold winters to break dormancy and struggles in warm climates without sufficient chill hours. Sea kale is a European coastal plant that produces blanched shoots in early spring with a flavor similar to asparagus or mild cabbage. The leaves and flowers are also edible. How it behaves like a fruit tree. Sea kale develops a deep, woody root crown that stores energy and regenerates growth each spring. The crown structure is similar to that of asparagus, but even more robust. Once established, it can persist for many years. Why it requires little care. This plant evolved on coastal cliffs and tolerates salt, wind, sandy soil, and drought. It typically needs no fertilization and resists most pests. The main labor is the optional blanching process, covering emerging shoots to keep them tender and mild. The common mistake that causes failure. Planting in heavy, poorly drained soil. Sea kale requires excellent drainage and will rot in waterlogged conditions. It prefers cool maritime climates and may struggle in hot, humid summers. Sandy or gravelly soil is ideal. Climate note. Hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8. Good King Henry is a traditional European vegetable that produces spinach-like leaves and asparagus-like shoots from the same plant. It was a common garden crop for centuries before falling out of favor. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The plant develops a deep taproot and woody crown that survives winter and regenerates each spring. It can remain productive for 5 to 10 years or longer. The young shoots emerge in early spring, followed by leafy growth that continues through summer. Why it requires little care. Good King Henry tolerates partial shade and average soil. It rarely needs fertilization, requires minimal watering once established, and has few pest problems. The plant essentially takes care of itself once the root system matures. The common mistake that causes failure. Expecting immediate productivity from seed-grown plants. Seeds require cold stratification to germinate, and young plants need 2 to 3 years to develop strong roots before regular harvesting begins. Starting from divisions or established plants accelerates production. Climate note. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9. The plants covered so far persist as individuals. The next category works differently. These vegetables renew themselves through division, bulbal production, or persistent clumping. Individual plants may not live for decades, but the systems they create perpetuate indefinitely through natural multiplication. Once established, they maintain themselves without replanting, functioning as permanent food-producing colonies, even as individual plants within them turn over. Egyptian walking onion is a hardy perennial that produces clusters of small bulbils at the top of its stalks instead of flowers. These topsets grow heavy, bend the stalk to the ground, and root to form new plants, allowing the colony to slowly migrate across the garden. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The bulbs at the base multiply by division each year, while the topsets create new plants at a distance. The colony expands and perpetuates itself indefinitely. Underground bulbs, green stalks, and topset bulbils are all edible, providing multiple harvests from the same planting. Why it requires little care. Egyptian walking onion tolerates cold, heat, drought, and poor soil. It rarely needs fertilization, requires no dividing, and needs no replanting. The natural reproduction cycle maintains the colony without intervention. The common mistake that causes failure. Harvesting all the topsets before they can root. The walking reproduction is what makes this plant self-perpetuating. Allow some topsets to fall and establish each season to maintain the colony's vigor and spread. Climate note. Hardy in USDA, zones 3 through 9. Welsh onion, also called bunching onion or scallion, is a clump-forming perennial that produces green onion shoots year after year without forming large bulbs. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The clumps expand each year through division. A single planting becomes a spreading colony that produces continuously. The plants survive winter as dormant clumps and resume growth in spring. Individual clumps can persist for many years. Why it requires little care. Welsh onion tolerates a range of conditions and needs minimal attention once established. It requires no annual replanting, little to no fertilization, and resists most pests. Occasional division every few years rejuvenates production, but is not strictly required. The common mistake that causes failure. Treating it as an annual and pulling entire plants at harvest. Instead, harvest by cutting leaves above the base or by removing only outer divisions from the clump. This allows the central plant to continue growing. Climate note. Hardy in USDA, zones 3 through 9. Chives form dense clumps of slender, hollow leaves with a mild onion flavor. The plants produce edible purple flowers in late spring that attract pollinators. How they behave like a fruit tree. The clumps expand each year through root division. A single planting becomes a permanent patch that produces for many years. The plants die back in winter, but regrow reliably each spring from the persistent root mass. Why they require little care. Chives tolerate poor soil, partial shade, and drought. They rarely need fertilization and have few pest problems. The main maintenance is occasional division every 2 to 3 years to prevent overcrowding, which is also an opportunity to expand the planting. The common mistake that causes failure. Letting the clumps become too dense without division. Severely overcrowded chives produce thin, weak leaves and may decline. Dividing and replanting sections every few years maintains vigorous growth. Climate note. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9. Garlic chives produce flat, solid leaves with a mild garlic flavor. The plants form expanding clumps and produce white flowers in late summer. How they behave like a fruit tree. Like regular chives, garlic chives expand through root division and persist for many years. Additionally, they self-seed readily, sometimes too readily. A single planting can become a permanent feature of the garden through both vegetative spread and seedling establishment. Why they require little care. Garlic chives tolerate drought, poor soil, and partial shade. They rarely need fertilization or special attention. The main maintenance is removing spent flower heads if you want to prevent excessive self-seeding. The common mistake that causes failure. Allowing unrestricted self-seeding in a small garden. Garlic chives can become invasive through prolific seed production. Deadhead the flowers before seeds mature, or plant in a contained area where spreading is acceptable. Climate note. Hardy in USDA, zones 3 through 9. Everything covered so far works in cold climates. The final category has a different requirement. These vegetables behave as perennials, only in frost-free or mild winter climates. In colder regions, they function as annuals or require special protection. For gardeners in warm zones, however, these plants establish permanent systems that produce for many years. Chayote is a vigorous climbing vine that produces pear-shaped fruits with mild, crisp flesh. In frost-free climates, the tuberous root system survives winter and regenerates new vines each spring. How it behaves like a fruit tree. The underground tuber stores energy and expands over time, becoming increasingly productive. A mature plant can produce 50 or more fruits per season. The root system can persist and produce for 8 years or longer in suitable climates. Why it requires little care. Once established, Chayote requires only a sturdy trellis and occasional watering during dry periods. It has few pest problems and produces heavily without added fertilization. The vigorous growth requires little encouragement, the common mistake that causes failure. Planting in climates with hard frost without protection. Chayote tubers cannot survive frozen soil. In zones 8 and colder, the roots must be heavily mulched or lifted and stored indoors for winter. In zones 9 through 11, it functions as a true perennial. Climate note: reliably perennial in USDA. Zones 9 through 11 can be grown as an annual or with winter protection in zones 7 and 8. Tree collards are a perennial form of collard greens that develop woody stems and can grow for many years in mild climates. They produce a continuous supply of nutritious leaves without annual replanting. How they behave like a fruit tree. The stems become woody and persistent, supporting the plant through multiple seasons. In frost-free areas, tree collards can live for 10 years or more, growing into large shrubs. They produce leaves year-round in mild climates, with heaviest production in cooler months. Why they require little care. Tree collards need only occasional pruning to maintain shape and encourage new leaf production. They tolerate poor soil and moderate drought once established. No annual seed starting or transplanting is needed. The common mistake that causes failure. Planting in climates with hard freezes without protection. Tree collards are hardy to approximately 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but extended freezes or temperatures below 15 degrees can kill them. In colder regions, grow them in containers that can be moved to shelter, or treat them as annuals. Climate note: reliably perennial in USDA zones 8 through 11. Marginal in zone 7 with winter protection. These vegetables share a fundamental characteristic with fruit trees: permanence. They establish systems that persist through seasons and years, storing energy, surviving dormancy, and regenerating without human intervention. The shift in thinking this requires is significant. Annual vegetables demand repeated investment. Seeds, soil preparation, transplanting, and removal at the end of each season. Perennial vegetables demand patience up front, but that patience converts into years of low-maintenance production. The establishment period is real. Asparagus and rhubarb need years before full harvest. Sea kale and good King Henry require time to develop their root reserves. Even the self-renewing alliums take a season or two to form productive colonies. But once established, these plants function as permanent infrastructure. The Jerusalem artichoke patch that expands on its own. The asparagus crown that improves with age. The walking onion colony that perpetuates itself indefinitely. This is not about avoiding work. It is about investing effort once into systems that continue producing. The same principle that makes a fruit tree worth planting applies here. The years of harvest that follow the establishment period far exceed the initial investment. For gardeners willing to think in terms of years rather than seasons, these vegetables offer something most crops cannot: permanence.